So you might have seen this thing in the news lately about the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security taking a trip down to Latin America.
Yeah.
And maybe you even heard like some rumors about tariffs possibly being put in place.
Right.
And you're probably thinking, okay, well, that's interesting, but what does this actually have to do with me?
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking into today.
What's interesting right away is the very direct connection between those two things.
Yeah.
The secretary's visit wasn't just a normal, diplomatic thing. It was really tied to the possibility of these huge tariffs that President Trump has been kind of alluding to on goods coming from Latin America.
Yeah.
And to put that in perspective for you, these tariffs could actually be several percentage points of the total yearly economic output of some of these countries.
Yeah, we're talking about something that could really put a lot of pressure on these economies, which are already dealing with all sorts of things going on around the world.
Right.
So what we want to do today is to unpack this whole thing for you. This isn't just some trade negotiation. It gets into how countries control their borders.
Exactly.
It even gets into things like our own digital information and who can actually access it.
Absolutely.
So we've got a whole bunch of news reports and expert analysis here, and we're going to try to break it all down.
Yeah, let's get right to it then. The tariffs and what the U.S. is actually asking for.
Okay.
The secretary had some discussions, particularly with Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum, and they were reportedly pretty straightforward.
Straightforward is one way to put it.
Yeah.
The U.S. basically came with a list of demands.
Yeah.
And first on the list was a really big increase in security along Mexico's southern border with Guatemala.
Okay.
And we're not just talking about like a couple extra guards. We're talking more personnel, new checkpoints,
Right.
and even bringing up the idea of making that border wall even bigger.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's not even everything.
Oh, there's more.
Oh, yeah. They also want Mexico to start scanning every single cargo flight that's headed to the U.S. from Mexico.
Yep.
So imagine the logistics of trying to do something like that.
Yeah, that's intense.
It's a pretty big effort to control what's coming across the border by air.
Makes sense.
And then you have these requests about criminal record checks when people are crossing into the U.S.
Right.
They want Mexico to step up their screening process and share all of that information.
Hmm.
But as we sort of hinted at before, the real sticking point seems to be this demand for biometric data.
Okay. Yeah, the fingerprints, facial scans, that kind of thing
Exactly.
from migrants and travelers.
Yeah.
And they want it shared directly with the U.S.
That's right.
This is like a whole new level of data collection and sharing personal information across borders.
It is. And President Sheinbaum over in Mexico, she didn't just say yes to everything.
Right.
In fact, she was pretty hesitant, especially about putting more military on the border with Guatemala.
Well, that makes sense.
And her reluctance is really important to understand this whole thing. She doesn't just want to focus on security and the military. She wants to focus on improving the economy in southern Mexico and Guatemala.
So what's her solution?
Well, her proposal was actually pretty detailed.
Okay.
She wants to create these industrial hubs in Tapachula, which is right there on the border,
Mm-hmm.
and she wants to extend the interoceanic train further into Guatemala.
Wow. So it's like a whole different way of dealing with migration.
Totally different.
Yeah.
One is all about being strict and controlling the border,
Yeah.
and the other is about helping people by giving them jobs and improving the economy in those areas so they don't feel like they have to leave.
I see.
Now, here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
You've got people in the U.S. like J.D. Vance who say developing countries should just stay as sources of cheap labor.
That's a pretty blunt assessment.
It is, and it completely clashes with Mexico's plan to grow their economy in the South.
Right, because they're basically saying these countries should just keep providing cheap stuff to richer countries.
Yeah.
And that obviously doesn't help them grow their own economies.
Exactly. And when it comes to that big request for biometric data, Mexico's kind of stuck.
Oh, how so?
Their systems aren't really set up to handle it the way the U.S. wants.
Hmm.
They do have this thing called the Unique Population Registry Code.
CURP?
Yeah, the CURP, which is like a national ID number.
Okay.
But the technology they need to collect all the fingerprints and facial scans, it's still being developed.
So they're behind.
Yeah, President Sheinbaum's working on upgrading the CURP to have all these high-tech features like a super ID card. But it's going to take a while.
Interesting, because a lot of other Latin American countries are actually ahead of Mexico when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Yeah, they've been doing it for like the past 10 years.
And a big reason why they've been able to do it is because they've had financial help from some big global organization.
Oh, really?
Yeah. the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank.
Okay.
They have this program called ID4D, which basically promotes digital ID systems all over the world. And they've given a ton of money to these countries in Latin America to help them set up these digital ID systems, which usually involve biometric data.
So what are they saying these systems are for?
Well, they say it's to improve security, keep track of people, and basically modernize how people are identified.
Yeah, it sounds good when you say it like that.
It does. But there are a lot of people who are worried about these digital ID systems.
Oh, why?
They're worried about what it could mean for basic human rights.
Oh, okay.
You've got this group, the NYU Center for Human Rights and Global Justice.
Okay.
They've been pretty vocal about this.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
They looked into the World Bank's ID40 program, and they're not happy about it.
What's the problem?
Well, they basically said it could be a digital road to hell.
Okay, what does that even mean?
What they're saying is that the whole way we think about people could change.
Okay.
We might stop seeing individuals as having rights and start seeing them as like economic units that can be tracked.
Wow, so their value is tied to how much they participate in the digital economy.
Exactly. And the CHRGJ is also really worried about how these systems could be used to violate people's rights.
In what way?
Well, they're talking about things like mass surveillance, unfair arrests because of bad data, and even people being denied basic services.
So, like, if your digital ID is messed up or flagged for some reason, you might not be able to get the things you need.
Right. And they also make this really interesting point.
What's that?
They say that the people who benefit most from these systems might not actually be the people they're supposed to help.
Okay, who benefits them?
The governments and the tech companies who make and run these systems.
Wow.
So when President Sheinbaum said the U.S. wants this biometric data primarily for migration control, that word primarily is really important.
Yeah, it makes you think about what else they might use all this data for in the future.
Right, like what's the bigger picture here?
It's a good question, and while this whole thing is going on with Mexico, something similar happened with Colombia.
Oh yeah, they recently agreed to share biometric data with the U.S. too.
And the timing of that agreement is pretty interesting.
How so?
It came after the U.S. and Colombia had a bit of a disagreement about stopping deportation flights.
Okay.
And then the U.S. started talking about tariffs again.
Oh, so that probably had something to do with Colombia's decision.
Yeah, it seems like it.
So what are they saying it's for?
Officially, they're saying it's to help manage migration and fight crime.
Right. Using fingerprints to identify criminals makes sense.
Yeah, but a lot of people in Colombia are worried about how much data will be shared, who in the U.S. will be able to see it, and whether anyone will be checking to make sure it's being used properly.
Yeah, those are important questions.
And there are even legal issues.
Really?
Yeah, I heard that under Colombian law, they might only be allowed to share data on foreigners, not their own citizens.
So what happens if the U.S. wants data on Colombian citizens? That's a big question, and it's not just about the law.
What happens to all this information once the U.S. has it, especially with the way things are changing over there?
You're talking about how the U.S. has been getting rid of regulations on things like AI, privacy, and tech ethics.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
When you don't have as many rules, it becomes easier to use this kind of data for other things.
And it just so happens that some really powerful people in the tech world have a lot to gain from government contracts for things like surveillance.
We're talking about people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and Larry Ellison.
Oh, wow, big names.
Yeah, and their companies like DOG, Palantir, and Oracle.
Okay.
They're all involved in providing technology to the government, especially for border security and surveillance.
Remember, the U.S. already has a huge biometric database.
Yeah, second only to China.
Hundreds of millions of people are in that database across all these different government agencies.
And the Biden administration, even before all of this, they said they would share that database with countries in the visa waiver program. Yeah, in exchange for their citizens' biometric data.
Wow.
They said it was to make things safer and easier for international travel.
Okay, but how much control is there over this data sharing?
That's the thing, it's all automated, and there probably aren't a lot of humans checking to make sure it's right.
So what happens if there's a mistake?
Good question. And it looks like the administration wants to take things even further.
How so?
They're pushing for stricter voter ID laws that use biometrics like they have in India and Brazil.
Interesting.
And they've been deporting more people, including some controversial moves like sending Venezuelans to El Salvador.
Wow.
And some people are saying they're trying to silence dissent.
What do you mean?
There have been reports of foreigners being deported for criticizing certain geopolitical situations.
So they're cracking down on free speech.
Yeah, and when you put all of that together with this push to get more data from Latin America, it definitely seems like a power play.
Yeah, it does. And remember all that talk about a smart wall? It's starting to look like it's not just about a physical wall.
Right, it's about creating a whole system of digital surveillance.
Exactly. And this expert, Petra Molnar, she's worried about the technologies they're using at the border spreading to other parts of our lives.
Like what?
Things like facial recognition drones and even AI lie detectors.
So the things they're testing out at the border could end up being used everywhere.
That's what she's saying. And we can't forget about the money involved.
Oh, yeah. Border security is a huge business.
Billions of dollars.
And the more technology and data they use, the more money these tech companies make.
Right. And it seems like there's not a lot of oversight in this industry.
So they can basically do whatever they want.
It seems like, and it's not like this all started with this administration.
Yeah.
The groundwork for this smart border has been going on for a while under both Democrats and Republicans.
That's true. So when you look at everything that's happening, it seems like it's all about trying to control things in a world that's becoming more and more unstable.
Yeah. Governments and big corporations are turning to technology and data to manage people and borders.
And Latin American countries are in a tough spot.
Yeah.
They have to choose between economic problems from tariffs or giving up their citizens' data.
And it feels like a lot of them are going to have to give in.
Yeah, that makes me wonder about something.
What's that?
What does all this surveillance mean for our freedom in the future?
That's a huge question.
It really is. So
Yeah.
let's wrap this up by going over what we talked about today.
Okay.
We saw how international trade can clash with a country's right to make its own decisions.
Right.
We talked about different ways to deal with migration, some focusing on being tough and some focusing on improving people's lives. And we looked at how individual rights are being affected by the government's growing use of technology to control things.
And we hope this deep dive has helped you understand these events that might seem like they're not connected.
Yeah, the secretary's trip, the tariff threats, the demand for biometric data, it's all part of something much bigger. So here's one last thing to think about.
Okay.
The world is becoming more and more connected, and we use technology for almost everything now.
Right.
So how do you think we're going to balance the need for security with the need for economic stability and the right to privacy in the future?
Yeah, that's a conversation that needs to happen.
It does, and your opinion matters